A 14-year-old boy was discovered on a railroad track in a small Missouri town, struck and killed by a passing train. For 27 years, investigators called it a tragic accident. But here is the detail that never made sense. The tracks where his body was found were nowhere near the path he would have taken to get home. He was walking away from safety, toward a place he had no reason to go. And when the county sheriff's office finally reopened this case decades later, they uncovered something far darker than an accident, a rope around his neck and an autopsy detail that changes the entire nature of this crime. In July 2026, 3 brothers were arrested and charged with his murder. This is the story of Justin Hocutt and the 27-year silence that finally broke.
14-year-old Justin Hocutt of Seligman was last seen alive on the morning of October 9th of 1999. About 22 hours later, his body was found on train tracks near his home.
In the early hours of October 9th, 1999, in the small town of Seligman, Missouri, a 14-year-old boy named Justin Hocutt was staying the night at a neighboring house. He was not at his own home. He was next door, spending time with a teenage girl who lived there, a girl investigators would later describe as someone he had been seeing. Somewhere between 4 and 5 o'clock that morning, someone inside that house discovered the two of them together. What happened in the minutes after that discovery would remain a mystery for nearly 3 decades. The story investigators were told at the time was simple and clean. Justin had been woken up, told to leave, given a moment to put on his shoes, and sent out the door on foot. 22 hours later, that story collided with a very different reality. Justin's body was found on the railroad tracks near his house, struck by a train. On the surface, it looked like exactly what small-town tragedies often look like: a kid cutting through the wrong place at the wrong time, a horrible accident nobody could have prevented. But almost immediately, there were problems with that explanation. Problems that investigators in 1999 either couldn't solve or chose not to look at too closely. The first problem was the route itself. If Justin had truly been sent home on foot, the direct path back to his father and grandparents' house did not require him to cross a road, climb an embankment, and walk out onto an active railway. That stretch of track sat away from the route he should have taken. It made no sense as a shortcut, and it made even less sense as a place a frightened, freshly scolded teenager would wander to in the dark. Toxicology only deepened the confusion. There was no alcohol in his system, no drugs, nothing that would explain disorientation or poor judgment. There was also nothing in his background suggesting he was suicidal. He was, by every account from the people who loved him, a normal kid. His Aunt Tammy Tolbert remembered a boy who loved animals, rode his bike around the neighborhood, went to the movies with friends, and collected baseball cards like it was the most important job in the world. For years, the case sat in a kind of investigative limbo. The scene at the tracks had been treated as the primary crime scene from the very beginning, which meant that any evidence at the neighboring house, the last place Justin was seen alive, was never processed the way it should have been. By the time anyone started asking harder questions about what happened inside that residence, the moment to properly document it had already passed. And that gap, the space between what happened in that house and what happened out on the tracks, became the central mystery that would haunt this case for almost 30 years. Then, slowly, over the years that followed, a very different account began to surface. According to details that would eventually be laid out in a probable cause statement filed decades later, what happened after Justin was discovered inside that house was not a quiet dismissal. It was an assault. One witness described him being struck and kicked. Another described a rope being placed around his neck. Other accounts mentioned objects that may have been used against him: a stick, a cane, possibly a baseball bat. The details did not always line up cleanly from witness to witness, which is exactly what investigators would expect after so many years. But a disturbing pattern kept repeating. Justin may never have walked out of that house on his own 2 feet. If that account is true, it changes everything about how the railroad tracks fit into this story. They were not somewhere Justin wandered to by accident. They became the place someone took him. And that raises the single most disturbing question in the entire case. When Justin reached those tracks, was he already dead? Or was he still alive when the train arrived? For years, one theory dominated. Some investigators believed Justin had already been killed before he ever reached the railway, and that the impact of the train had simply destroyed whatever evidence existed of what happened beforehand. The limited amount of blood found near the point of impact seemed to support that idea, suggesting to some that he had died somewhere else and been moved to the tracks afterward. But the renewed investigation reached a conclusion that is almost too disturbing to say out loud. According to the probable cause statement filed against one of the suspects, the doctor who performed Justin's autopsy determined that he was still alive when he was placed on those tracks and struck by the train. If that is accurate, the railway was not where someone hid a body. It was the final act of the murder itself. It's important to be honest about the limits of that claim, because the complete autopsy report has never been made public. What exists is an investigator's summary of the doctor's conclusion, not the full medical file, and that distinction will matter enormously once this case reaches a courtroom. The uncertainty inside the house and the uncertainty on the tracks created a case that was almost impossible to prosecute in the years immediately following Justin's death. Investigators were essentially trying to reconstruct two separate crime scenes at once: a house where an assault allegedly took place, and a railway where a death was made to look like an accident. And the people who could speak to what happened in that house were largely connected to the people living there. Barry County Sheriff Danny Boyd, who would eventually take over the investigation, pointed to a specific flaw in how the original case had been handled. Several of the earliest witness interviews were conducted inside the homes of the very people who might later become suspects, an environment that could easily influence what a frightened or loyal witness was willing to say out loud. Time did what time always does to cold cases. People who might have known the truth died before they could be questioned again. Memories shifted, blurred, and in some cases hardened into versions that may not have matched what actually happened. Physical evidence sat in storage for years, waiting for testing that never came. The case was reopened more than once over the following decades. Detectives conducted additional rounds of interviews in 2009, 2010, and 2011 after new tips surfaced. And each time, investigators walked away with the unsettling feeling that people knew more than they were saying. But feeling that someone is lying and proving a murder in a court of law are two very different things. And for years, the case remained stuck exactly there, suspended between suspicion and proof. Everything changed in 2020, when Danny Boyd became sheriff of Barry County and made Justin Hocutt's case one of his top priorities. Boyd was not looking at a fresh crime scene with warm evidence and cooperative witnesses. He was looking at a file more than 20 years old, filled with witnesses who had aged, some who had died, and physical evidence that needed to be re-examined with modern eyes. His team went back through every old report, every original interview, retracing the route between Justin's home, the neighboring house, and the railway, piece by piece. In the process, they discovered something startling. Some evidence collected all the way back in 1999 had apparently never even been sent for testing. In May of 2026, the Barry County Sheriff's Office formally requested help from the Missouri State Highway Patrol's Division of Drug and Crime Control. Evidence was finally sent to the state lab for the analysis it should have received decades earlier. But this was never a case that modern forensics alone could crack open. There was no dramatic DNA match, no single piece of physical evidence that suddenly explained everything. Instead, investigators went back to something far more difficult to obtain after 27 years: the people themselves. Sergeant Bradley German, one of the investigators on the case, said they believed there were still people out there holding on to important information, people who had carried a piece of this secret for nearly 3 decades. The patrol made public appeals, following up on leads that had come in over the years, hoping that time might have loosened tongues that fear had once kept shut. Between February and May of 2026, investigators conducted an entirely new round of interviews and laid them side by side against statements taken all the way back in 1999. And that is when the case finally began to change shape. It wasn't one dramatic confession that broke it open. It wasn't a single witness suddenly telling the whole truth. It was something quieter and, in some ways, more convincing. Small details scattered across decades of separate interviews that were finally beginning to overlap. For the first time in 27 years, investigators believed they could build an actual sequence of events. And that sequence led directly back inside the house where Justin was last seen alive. The picture that emerged was built from fragments, not from one clean narrative. Some witnesses said they had personally seen part of the assault unfold. Others said they had only heard it happening from another room. Still others described conversations that took place afterward, whispered admissions, second-hand accounts passed from person to person over the years. One of the most chilling details to emerge involved what came after the assault. The probable cause statement describes a rope placed around Justin's neck, along with references to him being taken toward the railway. And then there was the matter of the bleach. One witness claimed that several gallons of bleach had been purchased around the time of Justin's death. Years earlier, a former detective named Brian Martin had described finding a vacant apartment in the area that smelled overwhelmingly of bleach and reacted to luminol testing, the chemical test used to detect trace amounts of blood. But Martin was careful to note that bleach itself can trigger a false positive on a luminol test, which meant that detail alone raised suspicion without conclusively proving anything. Investigators also collected statements about things allegedly said in the aftermath, admissions attributed to members of the Scott family, along with conversations reportedly held between other individuals connected to the case. Each time, detectives had to do the painstaking work of separating first-hand knowledge from rumor, second-hand gossip that had simply calcified into local legend over 27 years. By the summer of 2026, investigators believed they finally had enough to move forward. Arrest warrants were issued for 3 brothers, Mark Wesley Scott, Bobby Ray Scott, and David Ray Scott. All 3 were charged with first-degree murder, but the level of detail behind each charge is not identical. The most specific allegations are laid out against David Scott, who investigators accuse of taking part in the assault itself, striking or stomping Justin, and then helping move him toward the railway once he was incapacitated. For Mark and Bobby, the publicly available records are less detailed about their individual roles, even though they face the same charge. A shared connection to that house on the night of October 9th, 1999, does not automatically mean identical conduct by everyone inside it, and that distinction will almost certainly become a central battleground once this case reaches trial. There is another detail here that makes this arrest feel less like a sudden breakthrough and more like the closing chapter of a story that had been building for years. This was not the family's first brush with these suspects. Back in 2001, just 2 years after Justin's death, his father shot and wounded both Mark and David Scott. A raw, desperate act from a grieving father who had likely suspected these very men all along, long before the state had enough evidence to charge anyone. For 20 years, suspicion and grief sat right next to each other with no legal resolution in between. In July 2026, that finally shifted. Mark and Bobby Scott were arrested in Arkansas and held in the Pulaski County Jail before their extradition hearings, while David Scott was arrested in McDonald County, Missouri, and later transferred to the Berry County Jail, booked on July 23rd under a first-degree murder charge. An arrest is not a conviction, and everyone involved in this case knows that better than anyone. The warrants establish probable cause, not guilt. Prosecutors will still have to prove, beyond a reasonable doubt, exactly what role each of these 3 brothers played on that October morning, and the credibility of witnesses whose memories span 27 years will be picked apart piece by piece in that courtroom. For Justin's family, none of these legal technicalities diminish what this moment means. For nearly 3 decades, they lived with photographs, a shelf of baseball cards, school memories, and a question that never went away. His aunts, Tammy Tolbert and Paula Roney, kept his memory alive through years of near-total silence, fielding rumors and second-hand claims from people who said they knew something, most of which could never be verified, and some of which directly contradicted each other. The case is far from over. A court will now have to determine exactly what happened inside that house before dawn on October 9th, 1999, who took part in it, and how Justin Hokut ended up on those tracks. Mark Scott, Bobby Scott, and David Scott have been charged. They have not been convicted, and the motive behind this alleged killing has never been publicly stated. The investigation remains active, and further charges are not off the table. But for a family that spent 27 years waiting for anyone, to finally answer for what happened to their 14-year-old boy, the wait, at long last, appears to be over.